I'm Neil Bradley, Executive Vice President and Chief Policy Officer at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and welcome to our first in a new event series called Common Grounds. You know, if you watch cable news or read the newspapers today, you can come away with the view that our politics are completely polarized, that Republicans and Democrats don't even talk to each other, and they might not even speak the same language. You hear people harking back to a time in which our elected representatives, after a day of meetings and votes, got together over a beer or a burger or the next morning over coffee and talked through the issues of the day, finding common ground and advancing solutions. Well, the truth is while we may not see it on cable TV and we may not read about it in the newspaper, it still happens today. Our elected representatives find ways to talk through issues, whether it's at the coffee shop, after work, or even in the gym, solving our nation's problems. You know, it's an important reminder of what we can do when we come together. And that's the whole reason we've launched this Common Ground series, where each month we'll bring together a leading Republican and a leading Democrat to talk about an important issue of the day and to hear from you and let you ask your questions. To put on display for really the whole nation that we can come together and we can solve problems. For this inaugural Common Ground series, I can think of no better congressman to kick us off than the two representatives we have with us today, Representative Seth Moulton and Rodney Davis. Representative Moulton is a Democrat. He's from Massachusetts. He's a former Marine Corps veteran. He's represented his district since 2015. Representative Rodney Davis is a Republican. He's from another part of the country. He's from Illinois. He's served the people of Illinois for 24 years, first as a congressional staffer and now as a member of Congress. I hope I don't hurt either of them by saying they actually like each other and they're friends. And you're probably going to see that coming out in a bit of our discussion today. So gentlemen, welcome. Thank you for joining us in our first Common Ground series.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks, Neil.
So we're here to talk infrastructure, and it's a really important issue. It's a huge priority for the U.S. Chamber, and I know both of you. But our series is called Common Grounds, and it's based on the idea that one thing that does bring people together sometimes is a little bit of coffee. I got my coffee addiction when I first started working on Capitol Hill, and so let's start with the coffee question. Do you drink coffee? And if so, how do you take it? Representative Moulton, we'll start with you.
3 times a week. I get 3 coffees a week. That might sound a little strange, but I ration myself to only 3. And for those of you who subsist on coffee and you're thinking, my gosh, how do you only do 3? Let me tell you, when you only have 3 coffees a week, each one is extraordinary.
Representative Davis, do you only do 3 coffees a week? Because I think I do 3 a day.
You know, I'll be honest with you both. I don't drink coffee. I have never gotten a taste for coffee. My wife, on the other hand, and all my kids drink coffee. But I have found that my early morning drink of choice is Diet Coke or Diet Pepsi. That's how I get my caffeine. As a matter of fact, it wasn't too long ago I could probably drink about 24 a day during a long day on the Hill. But I stopped cold turkey for 10 days one time just to see if I could do it. And now, because of that 10-day hiatus, I drink a lot more water.
Well, I'll tell you from personal experience that has not set back his energy levels. I see Rodney every morning in the gym. Every morning we're in Washington. I see him in the gym, and it's a great time to connect with a friend across the aisle. And he's always high energy. He's always ready to go. Always on the phone with his wife too. Good family man. So, Rodney, it's always a pleasure to be with you. And since we haven't been able to go to the gym recently, given the pandemic, it's especially nice to be here with you this morning.
Absolutely, Seth. And as you know, everybody can tell who's watching this, Neil, Seth and I just don't talk the talk. We're actually true friends. And I haven't had a chance to ask you this. How's your wife and your young child?
So Emmy is great. She's 2 and about a third, and we're about 6 days out from her younger sister arriving. So a very exciting time in the Moulton household. My wife is very ready to have the child. She's a real champ and a good sport. She's not complaining at all, but I can tell she's more than ready to pop this one out.
Well, on behalf of the chamber, congratulations.
Thank you.
All right. So we've talked coffee. We talked a little families. We do have some substance we want to get into. Infrastructure. I know it's an issue both of you care about. I heard someone say the other day, it's the best idea that everyone agrees on that never seems to get done. And both of you are nodding your heads, and I think you might agree with that sentiment as I did when I first heard it. Is there a chance to change that? Might we stop talking about it and start doing it? Rodney, what do you think?
Well, I certainly hope so, Neil. And you were here on the Hill when I first started. We developed a great friendship when you were working with then Majority Leader Cantor. You know me, I would come in and talk about areas that we could get together and in a bipartisan way to succeed on. And I would take those successes back home and talk about, not how Washington's so screwed up and how we don't like each other, how there's no bipartisanship. I would talk about where we actually come together. And during my first term, I was able to be named to a conference committee when it came to water infrastructure, also agriculture. And that really allowed me to develop even more bipartisan relationships in getting things done for members of the other party that might not have been in the majority. But some of their priorities that I thought were good priorities became my priorities. And that's what we can do again, especially on infrastructure. Seth and I both serve on transportation and infrastructure. And I sat down with Chairman DeFazio during a long markup last night. We shared a beer together near the end of it. And, we talked about what we can do together. And I'm certainly optimistic we can make that happen.
Seth, what's your take? Are you optimistic as well?
I am. Rodney's absolutely right. This is a priority of the American people. It's shared by people across the aisle of all political stripes. We've got to make sure that we have a forward-looking infrastructure plan that will build for the next century. But when we've done that in the past, it's benefited everybody in America. And I'm sure there's a way to get towards that today. I also think we have a very willing partner in the White House. Joe Biden is a big believer in infrastructure. He's made it clear that this is one of his priorities. And he's also made it clear that he wants to work in a bipartisan way to get it done.
So you all have very different districts. Congressman Moulton, you're on the coast outside of Boston there. I think you're joining us from Salem today, right? Representative Davis, you have something like 24 counties. Is that right in your congressional district?
I have 14 counties.
Oh, 14 counties. I was doing a little extra geography there.
We have Abraham Lincoln, though. We didn't burn any witches like Seth's district.
How do you, having very different districts, how do you approach it and find that common ground that you talked about when the infrastructure needs of your districts may be different and how you address them may be different? How do you both think about that? Seth, we'll go to you first.
Well, first of all, I think it's important to identify where we do have a lot of common interests. And my district is on the coast of Massachusetts. And that sounds very different than the middle of Illinois. But we have rural parts of my district. We have farming communities. We have a lot of places on the coast that are suffering from the effects of climate change, but maybe in different ways than folks in the middle of the country. But it's becoming a bit of a common language. And there are a lot of people who live one place and work somewhere else, which means they have to travel every single day just to do their jobs. So one of the things I try to do first is just establish where we do have common ground. And then where you find that you have disagreements, like, for example, urban transit is very important to my district. It's probably not as important to Rodney's. We can be smart about thinking about what is the right balance here to make sure that every community in America is adequately served and no one feels like they're terribly disadvantaged from one another.
Rodney?
We all represent our own districts, and our districts are much different, but you've got to have willingness to get to know your colleagues on the other side of the aisle. And it's a lot more difficult when many members get elected just from the far right or the far left. Remember when we used to have highway bills and highway reauthorizations and water reauthorizations, the only people who voted against it were usually those who identify with the far right or the far left. And you had an overwhelming number of members of both parties that came together because we would write a balanced bill. My district is much like some of my urban college districts, got to have 8 interstates that intersect at least a portion of my district in central Illinois. So, highway funding is a major issue for me, just like it would be for somebody who represents a more urban area. But my transit issues are not as large as Seth's transit issues. My transit issues are more around my universities and colleges, where the students are utilizing those services in what I would consider more mini urban areas. But one thing I found out in Congress, Neil and Seth and everyone watching, is that if you go in with the attitude that we agree a majority of the time more than we disagree, we can always find that balanced bill that's going to allow somebody to say, I got to win, I'm for it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I want you to expand on that a little bit, right? It's almost as much as the attitude that you start the discussions with as the attitude that you end the discussions with. So, how do you talk to your colleagues about starting with the assumption that we're going to try to find a way to get to yes and get to yes together, rather than starting with the assumption that we're all going to end up no, or half of us are going to end up no?
Any event at the chamber, without reminding you that I used to have those conversations with you when you might have not wanted us to think about how we get together on the front end rather than the back end. I jokingly tell Neil all the time that he's come to see my politics a lot better since he's become more of a squishy Republican over at the Chamber of Commerce. But you and I would have those discussions, and you were always somebody who understood what works best in my district is what we need to work toward. And there was one thing I found out about your work as a staffer, because I know, and Seth and I both know, that's where the work gets done around the Hill. It's making sure that people in Washington now, in the House and in the Senate, understand that we aren't enemies. We actually can talk to each other about getting good policy forward. And unfortunately, a lot of times nowadays, it seems because of the 24-hour news cycle, Seth and I are the ones vilified most by our far right and our far left if we even talk to each other. We got to get away from that.
No, you're exactly right. Who is the? And by the way, you're right. I have come to see your politics a little bit better. Maybe it's age, maybe it's where you sit sometimes, or maybe it's the experience of seeing what happens when we can't bring folks together and get stuff done. And I think we're seeing that around the country. Right now today, that the cost there is in fact a cost to inaction as well, right? If action costs, if it costs money to get an infrastructure bill done, it's also the case that it costs money not to get it done, either in longer wait times, potholes and breakdowns in your car. There are lots of ways that inaction costs. And I think you've reminded me of that more than a few times, and you were always right about that. We want to bring Congressman Moulton in on this too, because I think he's thinking about those same issues. When you talk to your colleagues on your side of the aisle, how do you start out by saying, how do we go in with a mindset that says, let's start by assuming we're all going to try to get to yes, rather than we're all going to try to get to no?
Well, I just talk about what it takes to actually get things done. And even more so, what it takes to get things done that will last, that won't simply be undone by the next time the other party is in power. I think Rodney said a couple of things that are important. One of which is that you have to find people that you can work with across the aisle. That sometimes it's the extremes on both sides that are the problem. Rodney is one of those guys. He's someone who tries to rise above party politics to do the right thing. I try to do the same, and that's sometimes it seems like that's becoming rare in our Congress. When I first ran, it was on a platform of bipartisanship, of being willing to work with people you disagree with in order to get things done for the constituents that we represent. And a lot of people would ask me, Seth, how do you work with someone like Ted Cruz? He was sort of the example of the moment. And my answer was very simple. I'd said, you don't work with Ted Cruz. You find people you can work with. And someone like Rodney Davis is someone that I've always been able to find some common ground with, both as a friend and as a colleague. And ultimately, that's better for the American people. That's better for the constituents that we serve back in our district. I think people have had enough of Congress just convening in Washington to bicker. They actually want Congress to get things done.
Yeah, that's right. The attitude that you both bring to it's clearly absolutely critical. But there of course are going to be thorny issues, and so I'm going to throw a thorny issue at you in the spirit of these bipartisan discussions, and that is, how do we pay for it? If there's an agreed upon sense, if the need is so great, are we going to be able to find common ground on this pay for issue? What do you think?
Rodney, you want to take it?
You go ahead. I'll finish up, man.
Rodney, you've been on T&I longer than I have, but I mean, one thing that strikes me about transportation infrastructure is that there are a lot of systems that have done well over the years with user fees, where we say the people who use this transportation system ought to pay the lion's share of the cost for its operation. And the problem is that you take highways, for example, because we haven't raised the gas tax since 1993, even just to keep pace with inflation, because vehicles are becoming much more fuel efficient. That's no longer the case. We have to make huge general fund transfers from all taxpayers, including taxpayers in my district, not all of whom even have cars, in order to pay for the highway trust fund. So trying to find some common ground, but also recognizing that we've had systems in place that have worked in the past and maybe they just need to be updated, is one thing that I think we need to talk about. Another thing I like to talk about is the fact that America is fundamentally a free market economy. But in the transportation and infrastructure sector, we have a lot of subsidies, a lot of unnatural subsidies. One thing we did recently in Massachusetts is just take a close look at what those subsidies actually are. People back here are familiar with the subsidies for our transit agencies because it appears as a line item in the budget every year, but they weren't as familiar with how much money goes to supporting our vehicle economy. So we commissioned a study to look at that, to just look at the costs of driving and land use and everything else. And now we have that number, so we can have a more balanced discussion about these subsidies and try to get everyone on a level playing field, so that the free market can have a hand and people can actually have the freedom to choose different modes of travel and let the best one win.
Well, free market is obviously music to the Chamber of Commerce's ears. But Rodney, what do you think? Can we solve this funding issue? What do you think has sets to prove?
Yeah, the answer is yes. But you can see now why people like me, I gravitate toward people like Seth, because it's about finding solutions. I came to Washington after being a congressional staffer, working on highway and infrastructure projects and infrastructure bills. I wanted to get on the T&I committee because I wanted to get us on a path to where reauthorizations were like clockwork. And at the same time, how do we make the Highway Trust Fund more solvent, not just fully funded, but more solvent? And as we look ahead, we have to understand, too, that the federal government, on one hand, is telling car manufacturers to make engines that burn less gas. And at the same time, we're only reliant upon gas tax revenues for the Highway Trust Fund. I know the Chamber recently came out with a plan to raise the gas tax to pay for infrastructure. And that's a diminishing return if that's all you're going to do. And frankly, politically, it's not going to pass. The gas tax only increase will not pass in the House of Representatives. And if it would have, then the majority would have put it forth as a pay for when they passed H.R. 2 during the last Congress. So what do? We have to have a user fee-based system. But we're going to see more electric vehicles on the roadways in the next few years, right? I mean, I hope so, because a manufacturer in my district, Rivian, I hope sells more electric vehicles. But right now, if you drive a fully electric vehicle, you are a freeloader. You pay nothing toward the Highway Trust Fund. So how do we diversify? And instead of looking at the gas tax and one user fee as our only source, how do we begin diversifying our sources, like somewhat of a 401k or a highway trust fund? You know as well as I do, when you invest in a 401k, your risk will be diminished and your returns will be larger because you're diversified. If we don't diversify, especially now, and you see electric technology get into our fleet level vehicles, the Highway Trust Fund will be decimated. So we need to come together Give everybody a chance for some input. It can't just be a debate about a VMT and a gas tax, because there are a lot of other ideas out there. And never underestimate the ability of, if a member of Congress feels that they have a voice in determining what that package is, they can go sell that as a win back home and vote for final passage.
This is what I love about this discussion. Not just challenging each other and finding areas of agreement, challenging the U.S. Chamber too. And we deserve to be challenged, just as Rodney did, because you're right. We have to think differently and more broadly, as both of you all are, when it comes to figuring out how to finance this. So I'll make a commitment to you right now. We'll sit down with both of your offices, your staffs, with a blank sheet of paper and an open mind about how we figure out how to pay for it, because the policies of the past have merit, but there aren't always the policies that are going to get us to where we want to go in the future. And we want to focus on getting to the future. And so,
Neil, I often, in describing this moment, I talk about how we have truly a generational opportunity to invest in infrastructure. Not everyone is in this position. It only comes every few decades. But we can't take this generational opportunity to invest in infrastructure and just invest in the last generation's infrastructure. We've got to invest in the future. And we talk a lot about how we fund it. Everyone knows we need more funding for infrastructure. We can see roads and bridges crumbling all around us. But we've also got to recognize that we're in a global world now, and we have to compete in a global economy. And we've got to make sure we're investing in the infrastructure of the future as well.
All right. Amen. And we want to bring in some of our local partners. It turns out we have local partners from Massachusetts and Illinois who actually have questions for you. So I'm pleased to invite Thomas O'Rourke, who's the president and the CEO of the Neponset River Regional Chamber, who's got a question that I think is going to you, Seth. Let's bring up Thomas's question.
Well, thank you, Neil, and thank you, Congressman Davis and Moulton, for your leadership and service. Back in 2013, Massachusetts approved a modest gas tax increase, which our chamber supported. This new revenue provided funding for the long overdue reconstruction of a major highway intersection at routes 95 and 93, just outside of Boston. The environmental, safety, and economic development benefits of this project were innumerable. Unfortunately, a ballot initiative overturned the gas tax hike, and the project was shelved. The need for the project, however, still exists. My question for you is, what can be done at the federal level to ensure funding for projects such as this?
Well, this is exactly what Rodney and I have just been talking about. And I supported that ballot initiative, or the raising of the gas tax in Massachusetts. A lot of states across the country have raised the gas tax, even though a lot of people in Congress don't seem willing to take that political risk. But as Rodney points out, that's really a short-term solution, because as we get more electric vehicles on the road, as vehicles, even gas-powered ones, become more efficient, it's not a long-term solution. So we've got to think bigger. We've got to explore ideas like VMT and others. But at the end of the day, we have to be committed to having a funding source, because there are a lot of infrastructure projects like the one that you just described, which aren't getting funding today. And ultimately, that makes us all less safe, spending more time in congestion and more time behind the wheel when we could be doing productive things for our work or for our family. I also think it's really important that we think outside the box. And this is something I'm trying to do here in Massachusetts. A lot of people look at highway congestion and think that the only way to solve highway congestion is to build more highways. That's actually literally been proven wrong. And it's been proven wrong not just here, but all across the globe. We've invested hundreds of billions of dollars in urban highway infrastructure in the last 30 years, and congestion has only gone up. So what other countries are realizing, and we've got to wake up to, is we have to look at alternatives as well. When you look at the South Shore of Massachusetts, for example, it's a prime spot that would benefit from better high-speed rail service. So that's another alternative that we've got to look at to solve these congestion problems.
Awesome. Well, we know, infrastructure is high on the agenda, but one of the things that you both are working on right now is COVID relief. I want to now go to Clark Carricker, who's the vice president of the Illinois Chamber, who I believe has a question for you, Rodney. Clark?
Discussions are ongoing about another round of COVID-19 relief funding. The Illinois Chamber is a strong advocate of business liability protections and direct aid to small business. Can you tell us a little bit of how those discussions are progressing?
Cole, hey, it's great to see you. Give my best to Todd Meisch, too. We started marking up the next stimulus package that, unfortunately, I think the leadership and the majority has decided to run on a partisan basis. That's not to say that I don't think, that's not to say that every member of the majority agrees that's the best path. And if Seth and I were able to sit at the table and come up with a plan, we'd probably have it done in a matter of about a couple of hours, because we would find that common ground. And one of the provisions that I think is lacking right now in any of the 5 bills that Seth and I worked on together and passed in a bipartisan way is liability reform. 10 years from now, we've got to be able to ensure that we don't have a trial attorney from maybe Madison County, Illinois, that I represent, that has been considered for decades one of the judicial hellholes of America. We have to make sure that that trial attorney doesn't go to places like the University of Illinois and decide to work on a class action suit of somebody who may have been infected with COVID at the time. Liability protections now are needed more than ever for us to get back to the economy that Seth and I and all of you on this call want.
Obviously, a lot of things that we have to work on together. I want to go to a few of our audience questions. And first, I want to go to Tracy Tappaney, who's the co-president of Wyoming Machine. And she asks, my question relates to the intersection of transportation and infrastructure investment and equity and inclusion. We're living in a time where many people are thinking about structural change. And I'm curious to know if Congress is thinking about how investments in transportation and infrastructure can support greater equity and inclusion in our communities. Seth, you want to lead off with that one?
Absolutely. I'm a big advocate of high-speed rail. I think it's the kind of 21st century investment in our transportation that we need to make so that America can be globally competitive and we can have much better, faster ways to travel around the country. And one of the things I like to point out is that when you have high-speed rail, it connects a lot of communities in America that right now are kind of left out of the fastest growing economies. So, for example, I'm here in Boston. If I want to get to Chicago these days, I pretty much have to fly unless I want to take a very, very long car ride. But those are the only 2 real viable options. If you had high-speed rail, you could get to Chicago in 4 or 5 hours, but you could also get to Buffalo and Cleveland and communities like that in between. Having connections like that from our coastal cities, the big cities like Chicago in the middle of the country, to smaller communities across the country would make us a more connected society, would make us a stronger, more connected economy, and ultimately would give people much more freedom of choice for how they want to travel. Sure, you could still choose to wait in long security lines and have your flight delayed every time there's a storm if you want to fly to Chicago, or you could choose to drive on our interstate highways. But like travelers in literally every other developed country in the world, you would also have the choice to take high-speed rail, which happens to also be safer, better for the environment, better for land use, and have a higher return on investment, a higher ROI, something your chamber members should appreciate for American tax dollars. So that's an example of how I try to think about these new transportation technologies and how they actually bring our country together and make us more inclusive.
Ronnie, how do you think about infrastructure and questions of equity?
Well, in districts like mine, it's bringing the infrastructure projects to areas that we need to focus on equity. And also, I'm glad Seth brought up high-speed rail because my district is part of the Chicago to St. Louis high-speed rail corridor. But we also have to be realistic. That corridor is not going to give us the high-speed rail speeds that Seth is talking about that we still need to work for. I'm a supporter of rail projects, but part of the reason why we are that corridor from Chicago to St. Louis is because we're now able to implement through other programs in the Department of Transportation, consolidating rail lines in the city of Springfield, Illinois, from 3 tracks into 1. In certain areas, 2 tracks into 1. And when you talk about equity, when you have tracks rolling through every neighborhood in one community, it stops portions of our community from being able to be treated equitably and seeing equitable investment. So when it comes to infrastructure projects, planning locally helps us to be able to make the decisions that are necessary in a larger scale out here in Washington, but really have a positive impact on equity and equitability when it comes to infrastructure.
You know, we're doing this event virtually, like we do lots of things in the middle of this pandemic. And while we've been focused on infrastructure of moving people and goods so far, there's also digital infrastructure that maybe is worth spending a few moments talking about. And that's actually what Larry Kidd, the president and CEO of ThinkHigher, is asking about. Larry says, many rural areas, such as where I live in Ohio, have such poor connectivity that most days it's impossible to conduct a Zoom meeting or offer online schooling to children. He goes on to talk about the disadvantages this creates for someone like him and his neighbors. How do you think about those type of connectivity issues when it comes to infrastructure? And is this going to be a place where we find common ground?
Well, I certainly hope it is, because you're absolutely right. The growing tech divide in our country is exacerbating racial gaps and the urban-rural divide that already are too great, that already exist and are already tearing our country apart. So a great example of this is actually the future 5G technology. This is the next, not just the next generation of wireless connectivity for your phone, so you'll be able to download that song more quickly. It's also a technology that's going to enable an Internet of Things. It's going to enable autonomous driving. It's going to enable all sorts of capabilities that we don't have right now. Now, sitting from my seat on the House Armed Services Committee, I also know that this is a national security issue. It's important for our national security. It's also important because China is currently beating us at the 5G game. And we can't afford to lose to China. We also can't afford to have communities across vast stretches of America that don't have 5G. I live in Salem, Massachusetts, just a 25-minute train ride, 45-minute drive from the center of Boston. We'll probably get 5G service very early because the market is going to bring it here. It's competitive for cell phone providers to install 5G at their own expense. But what about rural communities where there's no market incentive for private companies to come out and install 5G? We've got to have a solution for them too, or else people will be able to have autonomous cars here in Salem, Massachusetts, and they won't be able to have them in more rural parts of my district or rural parts of Rodney's. So we've got to make sure that we're globally competitive with these technologies. There's no reason why we should be behind China on 5G any more than we should be behind China on high-speed rail. We should have the fastest trains in the world, not China. We should have the best 5G in the world that we're selling to other countries, not worried about China commanding that market. And it also is important that we think about how we can equitably distribute those technologies so that every American can benefit from their use.
Rodney, I know you're focused on this as well. How do you think we're going to get connectivity, increased connectivity?
Well, I agree with what Seth said about 5G and 5G expansion. Frankly, we can have the speeds, but obviously, as you can tell from this video today, sometimes the technology we use makes it look like I'm halfway around the world in the dark, while Seth is in broad daylight on the East Coast like I am. I haven't stopped the access, but the technology that sometimes we use is going to continue to grow too in its capabilities. But I also want to take a step back, and we have to identify as policymakers on a regular basis, what isn't the federal government doing well when it comes to getting the access and the broadband to areas of our nation that still need that access. And it's not just about larger cities having better access than rural America that I represent. Yes, rural America and the most rural parts of my district are the ones who need broadband access the most. And we've come together to invest historic amounts of dollars in those services. But here's the problem. In the past, when government has funded rural broadband expansion through the Connect America funding programs, they haven't held companies accountable to actually living up to the standards and the speeds that they promised. So I have many rural areas that on a map at the Department of Commerce shows that they have broadband access, but they don't have anywhere near the speeds that were promised by the company that took your tax dollars and did not invest in those communities. Now, because of that, there are now penalties for not living up to those service performance standards. And that's because of things that happened in my district even years ago. But as we move ahead, we also can't fail to recognize that we need to invest in companies that are doing things right. My hometown of 12,000 people in central Illinois, we have 1 gig service that is available because we have entrepreneurs lay fiber around our communities, and they go and expand into smaller rural communities. In Taylorville, Illinois, I have better access to high-speed broadband than my constituents in certain parts of Champaign-Urbana, in and around the University of Illinois. So investments have to be made to get to the last mile, and that's where we should focus our tax dollars.
Well, as I think our audience can see, there is a lot to find common ground on, whether it's finding new financing mechanisms, getting an infrastructure bill done, or connecting Americans. I have a feeling we could continue this conversation for a few more hours, but unfortunately, Congressman Davis and Congressman Moulton have to get back to legislating and to their committee business. I just have one question for you. Can we count on both of you continuing these conversations over a cup of coffee and that Diet Coke or water, or when you're both back in the gym? We can count on both of you for that?
Absolutely, and definitely when we're both back at the gym. We've got to find a bipartisan way to get that gym open safely, of course, but we should be able to do it soon.
Thinking that happens. Yeah, I miss you, man. I miss seeing you down there. I miss the debates and discussions on infrastructure that you and I and Earl Blumenauer and Peter DeFazio would have on a regular basis. That's what makes Congress work. And I know we're looking ahead to the end of this pandemic. And what's going to, I think, be the best part about governing in Washington again is being able to share ideas. Because when we share ideas, our ideas then get taken to both sides, and then they become solutions together. And that's what Seth and I do well together. I appreciate you recognizing this and having us both on, but it doesn't mean, Seth, I'm not going to harass you when I see you next, too.
I fully expect that. In the meantime, please give my best to your family, Rodney. It's great to see you.
You too, and good luck with that new baby coming.
Thank you.
Boy or girl?
Girl.
Congratulations, buddy.
Thanks.
Congratulations. Well, thank you both. You guys are going to be hard. You're our first Common Ground series, but you're going to be hard to beat. So thanks for getting us off on a strong start, and we really appreciate the work that both of you are doing, not just on behalf of your constituents, but on behalf of the whole nation. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed our first in this new Common Ground series. You know, there are a lot of tough issues for our country to tackle, but I'm confident that if we have lawmakers like Congressman Davis and like Congressman Moulton figuring out how to discuss new ideas, challenge each other's ideas, and find common ground, that we're going to solve a lot of these problems. I'm also very pleased to recognize our partners at Compass Coffee, who put the grounds in this Common Ground series. For those of you who are not familiar with Compass Coffee, it is a local DC-based coffee roaster founded by 2 former Marines. They have 12 locations in the DC area, including right around the corner from the Chamber headquarters. They're expanding into the Mid-Atlantic region, and we're excited for the opportunities that this small business has to bring you the best in freshly roasted coffee. Their coffee not only fuels us, but their support helps fuel series like these. I hope you'll tune in to the next Common Grounds and help us tackle some more tough issues and get to know our elected representatives a little better. Thanks for tuning in.